All right, it is just past 12 o'clock. We will go ahead and get started here. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and you spending your lunch hour here with us at RVA Tech. I want to welcome you to today's RVA Tech T.I.Y, our Tech It Yourself series session on trans-affirming systems design. We are excited to have this session in place for today. And I want to take a quick moment and really thank Corgi Bytes, our sponsor for today. Corgi Bytes has helped us put on several webinars throughout the series over the past several months. If you're not familiar with Corgi Bytes, they are a software remodeling firm located in Richmond, and they specialize in making existing software systems more stable, scalable, and secure by paying down technical debt, upgrading dependencies, migrating platforms, increasing test coverage, and fixing bugs, and a whole lot more as well. Not only are they the sponsor for today's webinar, but Andrea Goulet of Corgi Bytes is here to help moderate the session and generate conversation with our speaker. So with that said, I'd love to introduce our speaker, Aaron White, who is the head of digital engagement at VCU Libraries. Aaron White has been making websites for over 20 years and currently leads the digital engagement department at Virginia Commonwealth University Libraries in Richmond. They direct the strategy for web infrastructure and strategy while also doing work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. In 2018, they led VCU Libraries' Gender Inclusive Library Work Group, and in 2019, their article, Trans-Inclusive Design, was published in A List Apart. So thanks so much, Aaron, for joining us today, and thanks again, Andrea, for moderating, and I will pass it over to you to get started.
Excellent. Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Aaron, and thank you everyone for attending today. Just a little bit about kind of the format. So Aaron and I are going to have a chat and we're going to learn all about the awesome work that they've been doing. And then we'll also have some opportunity for questions and answers. So you can either use the chat or you can use the Q&A button below. And I'll do my best to incorporate your questions into our conversation because I'm sure there are many. So Aaron, thank you so much. I am so glad to have this conversation. You and I have known each other for a very long time.
Yeah, maybe 10 years at this point.
I think it was even longer. Yeah, way back when I think it was like hash brown networking or something. It was like way back in the day. But anyway, it's been really great to see your career and to see you really lead VCU Libraries, especially when it comes to trans-inclusive systems design. Because one of the things that I think I'm seeing and why I thought RVA Tech would be a great platform to share some of your work is that we're in a place right now where I think there's a lot of people who are interested in diversity, equity, inclusion. They've kind of bought into the idea of it. They're like, okay, this is going to be part of our strategy. And then when the rubber hits the road and they go, wait, how do we do this? We see that a lot when we go to like modernize existing systems, and it can get really complex really quickly. And the work that you've done is incredibly technical. It's all about databases, but it's also incredibly human. So can you share kind of a little bit of your story and kind of how you came to this work? I believe every superhero has an origin story, so kind of tell us yours.
I love that. I love that framing. And yeah, I mean, I think this is a common challenge that we all embrace these values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or we'd like to. And then when it comes to operationalizing things, it's just like, okay, where do I even start? How do I do this? So that's the stuff I'm really interested in. But yeah, I don't know. I think to go all the way back, I grew up in rural Alabama, and as an adult, made my jettison escape, traveling slowly north. And I think so much of my choices in life have been bound up in the fact that I'm queer, that I needed desperately to leave the town that I grew up in, need to experience something new, and have enough distance to really feel like I could grow into who I was. And so that's been really the thing that's fueled so many of my steps in life, and getting me out of state to go to college, and then pursuing this career in internet production and creating websites, which as a teen like sitting on my parents' computer on a 56K internet connection. That was my way to sort of connect with the broader world and to try to understand who I was and how I fit in. And so that sort of was how my work in IT and my own identity threaded together from the very beginning. So coming to VCU for work, and that was 2009 when I moved to Richmond to take this job at VCU, and I've just been so supported this whole process. I've had great management and just been given a lot of opportunities to contribute not only with technology but in these diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, to spend time there and to get my own footing as someone who could potentially lead in the area. So
yeah,
I mean, highlights include doing work around equity for queer folks and for trans and non-binary folks, because this is something that's really clearly personal to me, and also really tried to thread in anti-racist theory and to try to not just limit the work to identities that I specifically hold, but to help hold space for folks who are Black or Brown, Indigenous, people of color.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And we actually have a webinar with Dr. Tiffany Jana. You can go back into the archives on anti-racism as well. So yeah, intersectionality. Yeah, intersectionality absolutely, I think, is part of it. So you in 2018 led were part of the gender inclusive work group. So tell me a little bit about kind of the evolution. Like, how did that kind of come about? And then I imagine that when you're working in a large institution, there's some bureaucracy and there's some buy-in and things like that, right? How did you get this group together, and where were some of the challenges and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, so the impetus for the group, actually, it was brought forward by my supervisor. We were maybe a year before, we had gotten this frantic email from the dean of our library, whose wife was teaching a class, and she was using Blackboard to teach the class, and the students' legal names were showing up in Blackboard, and they weren't able to change what names were showing up. So she had a trans student who was being dead named by Blackboard. And
for the people just who might be on the call who aren't familiar with the concept of dead naming, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah.
And why that would be so offensive?
Yeah. So dead naming is the act of using someone's name that they used before in their lives, that they were assigned at birth, a name that they no longer use for themselves and do not wish others to use for them. So doing that intentionally is an act of harm and should be avoided at all costs. And often the systems that we manage do that to people.
And then it's particularly offensive too when it's then publicly shown to everyone in the class, and so there's part of that as well.
Right. Well, because the other element is that these, your classmates are like, well, who is this? Who is this person?
Yeah.
And you have to be like, actually, it's me. And that's my legal name, because legally changing a name is onerous. It's often a multi-step process. Depending on what state you live in, it can require medical documentation. It can be very expensive and time consuming. And for some folks, they may be using a name that it might be that they've recently started using that new name, or they're trying it out. And so it can just be really difficult to change the legal name and then to accommodate the names that people use. So the name of use.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that sort of was the impetus for us talking as a manager group at the library about, okay, so the university doesn't have a way right now for people to say what the name they use is, but how as a library might we be able to offer that to our users to help them feel welcome and affirmed by our library?
Right.
The primary place where we record people's names is in our library circulation and inventory management system. So you come in to check out a DSLR camera or a book, and the person you're interacting with who works for the library can pull up your record and see your name, and maybe asking for identification to verify that you are who you say you are. So we ended up having this conversation about, okay, well, maybe we should have a task force or a group to look at ways we might update our system to be more inclusive of folks who use a different name. And then we sort of spiraled from there, right? So we had a group of folks who were interested, and that's what thing I love about my colleagues, is that they're just deeply interested in making a more equitable world. And so, like, right in that room, right there, we had several folks step forward and be like, yes, I'd love to work on this. And this was before I had come out as non-binary at work. So in my personal life, I was using they, them pronouns, but at work, I was still using she, her pronouns. And so all this time I was sort of doing this work with this group, like these amazing folks, and also, like, to some degree setting the stage for myself to be able to come out at work, which is what I did a few months later after our group was wrapped up. So, how did I get here? So anyway, so our group decided to expand our charge beyond just looking at our systems and thinking about how we can be more inclusive as an organization, not just in our systems, but in our services and our spaces, how our staff interact, and just trying to create an environment that was conducive for folks.
Yeah. So what were some of the key findings? And then, what were some of kind of the maybe technical challenges that you encountered along the way when you went to go implement some of these things?
Right. So, I mean, some of the key findings were having some flexibility in how people could share their names with the system. So one thing we implemented before the university did was the ability for folks to just send a message to one person in the library and just be like, I'd like for the library to use this name for me. And we would update our system so that whenever we ingested user records from the university's user database, we would overwrite the name that was given to us by that identity management system with the name that they provided to us. So it was sort of a one-off workaround. It definitely got us experience working with our central IT folks. We have a really good relationship with central IT and have for years, which you can't always say, but they were interested in this problem that we were trying to solve. And I think that there had also been some conversations happening at the university level about, okay, can we have a name of use field in our identity management system? But this is a massive cruise ship, right? So turning it takes so much time. It takes a lot of effort. There's so many interconnected parts. And so what we did was sort of a stopgap until the university was able to implement a name of use field, which actually launched this August.
Yay! That's not
it is great news. Yeah,
that's a big deal.
It's a big deal, and I hope that our students know about it and are able to take advantage of it, because I think one thing that we need to do a little more of is some publicity and let folks know that they can do it.
So what were some of the practices that you uncovered that I think, one of the things that you and I had talked about kind of in the pre-call was you came up with this saying that I love and I've used so many times, in that binaries are violent. And that, like, we tend to think and that can be a big deal when we talk about data, because it gets so kind of entrenched and enmeshed in the system design. And so, if you're cisgender and you just think, oh, everybody in the world uses he, she pronouns and that's all there is, right? That's how you encode it. And then you have to go back and detangle it. So, what are some of the things that you learned about maybe the assumptions that people who initially build systems do, and maybe they could do a better job of just being aware? And then also, what are some ways that you've named fields? Because I think there's some, people who have very good intentions and maybe say preferred pronoun. And it's like, no, it's not a preference. This is who I am. Like, this is the pronoun I use. So are there ways that the naming of things really matters? And are there some things there that you learned and that you would promote for other people who are in this process?
Yeah, absolutely. So we all know that systems reflect the biases of their developers.
Yep.
Whether they're stereotypes, whether they're widely held beliefs about how things are categorized and labeled. And we all have biases. We all have worldviews that come from our lived experience. So the thing we see in technology is that there's a pretty monolithic lived experience for a lot of IT developers. Which is, I think, one big part of this is to think about how we can bring in folks from a diversity of lived experiences to participate in our systems development and our design and our database design and our user experience testing, and how we can really, by having that diversity of perspectives, really strengthen our products and make them more welcoming for our users. So yeah, just like you said, even coming down to labeling fields, it's not a preferred pronoun, it's just your pronoun. It's not your preferred name, it's the name of use, it's the name you use. And sort of baking in these assumptions like, people won't need to ever change their username. So let's just, you pick one and then you're done forever. When in actuality, often our usernames are related to our first names in some way. And if we change our first name, or even if we change our last name, think about the case of marriage. Having some way for folks to change a name after they've created it, whether it's the name in the name field or the username. So just taking some of those assumptions is like, okay, this thing will never change, and actually being like, okay, maybe it does change. And this also has ripple effects to folks who whose names don't follow the Western name structure, who we always assume first name, last name, but that's not accurate. So the more flexibility we're able to build in, it creates some complexity on the back end, of course. And what it creates on the front end is something that validates humans' experience. So it's just a little more complicated, and it's worth it. And it's not like the world is going to get any less complicated, or that things are going to start following these sort of rigid rules that we sort of hold in our minds. So it's really about opening that up. And I think that our technology systems now are far more supportive of sort of this idea of identities, of names, of genders being a spectrum rather than a 1 or a 0. Because binaries can be really harmful. And it's kind of the thing where like once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Well, and I think it's not just with gender too. Like when we were talking, I struggled for the longest time because I have a marketing background. And so when I started learning how to code, I dress like a marketer, I talk like a marketer. Like you look at me and it's like, oh, that person's a marketer, not somebody who codes. And people would say, oh, are you technical or non-technical? And like, that's an example of a binary. Like I got that a lot. I still get that. And it's like, can I be both? Like, can I be creative and then also know how to code? And like trying to figure out where do I fit in one of these buckets? I'm like, I don't know. And it can be hard to kind of open that up. And I think people just use that by default, right? It becomes just this is the way it is. But like you said, then once you see it, it's like you can't unsee it.
Well, this is like one of the classic parts of cognitive psychology, right? That we categorize things, and it helps us to move through the world without having to reprocess every single thing every second, where we can focus on higher level concepts without having to look at a plant and be like, what is this thing that I'm looking at? It's a plant. So I mean, part of this is just like basic psychology. And, we're also humans, and we can deal with complexity and we owe it to each other.
And your software systems can deal with complexity too. I think that's one of the things is that people think that, oh, if I build a software system, then it's done and it's complete. But actually, like, it's incredibly malleable. You can go in and you can change it and you can adapt. And that's what we specialize in. So we see this a lot where it's like, okay, the intent has changed. The world has changed. We need to add this new functionality. And then there's this whole like, is it a bug or is it a feature? It's like, I don't know. It's changing the behavior. Who really knows? Like, does it matter?
That's a labeling issue.
Exactly. That's another example of a binary. Like,
and finished versus ongoing is another binary.
Exactly.
So once you think about it that way, it's just, can't unsee.
Did you encounter any pushback or like we really don't want people to have ownership over changing their name. What if, like, I'm imagining somebody who might be skeptical, like, what if somebody goes in and then creates a false identity or tries to use it for fraud? Like, did you have any pushback there? And how did you counter that? What were some of the things that emerged from your experience there?
I think the one instance was some folks being like, well, what if somebody makes their first name like a curse word, or like changes their first name to farts? And it's just like, well, then that's the name that shows up for them, and they have to deal with that. Like, it's kind of like, okay, so what's the worst thing that could happen from that besides somebody just like making an ass of themselves?
Mm.
But I think that was really the only pushback. I think, at VCU, it's been that folks are really on board with this and really frustrated with how long it can take to make changes. But another thing is funding and priorities. So, this was important in 2015, but all of a sudden it was very important in 2019. And that's when the money and the resources started really funneling in that direction. And I think a lot of it has been brought on by student activism, which I think is really amazing.
Yeah.
And so there's internal pressure and external pressure. So
yeah, I went to VCU. I graduated in 2003. And I remember when I was there in the late 90s, the early 2000s, the early aughts, that, like, the thing that I loved about VCU was how diverse it was. Like, it felt at that time like this is the way the world should be. Like, there were just all different people and all different lifestyles, and it was like, yes, this is great. And then I leave and it's like, wait, not everything is this way. So I think VCU has really led the way, and when I talk to my fellow students, my alum, like, that was the thing that we all valued the most. And you really miss it when it's not there. So yeah. Go Rams. I'm glad that is a priority.
Well, and I'm a big VCU cheerleader, and I'll also say that it's not always easy, depending, no matter where you are. And one other response we got early on was, oh, this is only a small number of people, so why should we worry about this? And so I ended up collecting a good amount of data. Well, number one, something to the effect of a third of our library staff were using a name that was different from their full legal first name. So this affects people who aren't trans. It affects lots of different folks. But then I also was just like, you know what? Statistically, the number of people on campus impacted by this change would be about 2,000 people based on current statistics. And it's only going to increase. And the fact that this is sort of a digital curb cut for folks, it's something that helps multiple types of folks. Also, like, how many people does it take? Like, how many people have to be negatively impacted by a system for you to care and for you to make a change?
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of both.
Yeah. We have Melissa who just asked a question of, do you think that the same changes could be made in the public school system? They don't have as much funding as a university does, and the kids don't have as much power of coercion that adult students do. So how do you then move this to where this is a standard practice, across all education or even across all organizations?
Yeah, well, it's going to depend on your school system too, right? So the city of Richmond, Richmond Public Schools, just this fall, I don't know how widely they publicized it, but they were like, email us if you use a different name, and we will change it. So to some degree, there's buy-in from administrators, school boards, depending on where you are, have a good amount of power, and also the software vendors. And so I think it's definitely like a collective sort of, why can't we show someone's name of use? Pressure on vendors, and depending on how active you'd like to get, working with your school board member, working with your superintendent and your school administrators to be like, this is not okay. And I know there was the comment about younger students maybe not having as much power as college students, but I'll push back on that a little bit. I think our school students have a lot of power, and
Mm.
the more folks get connected with each other and sort of build that power together, the more impact they're going to have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I believe in
Excellent.
the next generation. We're leaving it
Yeah.
with a pile of crap, so they're going to have to figure out how to make
Yeah.
it through the world, and I think that
Yeah.
they're already doing it.
Yeah. Teresa shares that her first name is Mary, but she uses her middle name Teresa. My partner actually does the same thing. His first name's Matthew. He goes by Scott, but he actually uses M. Scott because to differentiate himself from all the other Scotts in the world. And it's one of these, like, if you know, he has to have like M. Teresa. There we go. So yeah, so I think that's kind of the idea too. Like when you start kind of digging into this idea of accessibility, which I think this sort of falls under, that I think people tend to think of accessibility almost as an afterthought. Like, I'm going to build the system first, and then it's like, oh, there's some edge cases. And instead, there's in your work, you point to different inclusive design practices, where then that way it's about thinking about the range of experiences at the beginning rather than as an add-on at the end. So can you talk a little bit about kind of the process and how you might change from maybe the design practice that you have done for the past 15, 20 years to migrating to more of an inclusive practice? And the thing that I love is there's a saying in the world of accessibility that accessibility is good for everyone. And just like you said, it's like you can think about addressing the need of one population, and you actually also make it better for a lot of other people too. So yeah, can you talk a little bit about kind of inclusive design practices and how, as practitioners, when we're at the command line, we can actually start implementing some of these things?
Right. So I read a really great book a couple of years ago, Mismatch by Kat Holmes, talking about
Okay.
inclusive design. I think that was the title. It was either Mismatch or Inclusive Design. But so sort of moving our thinking from edge cases to stress cases, and
Okay.
saying these, someone needing to change their first name is not an edge case.
Mm-hmm.
It's a stress case. So imagining how our systems may not be pliable for folks,
Yeah.
and understanding how to look for those biases and assumptions that are baked in by
Yeah.
having that rigidity.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a big thing. And also maybe just like thinking through your own values as a designer, as a developer,
Mm-hmm.
and saying, okay, what are some important things to forefront here?
Mm-hmm.
Forefront flexibility for people to be able to be seen, and be accurately represented by a project. I
Mm-hmm.
want to forefront privacy. So, do I really need to ask for a person's gender, or am I asking for data as something to sell to advertisers? Why am I
Mm-hmm.
asking for this? So just really understanding the ripple effects of some of these decisions that on the face of it may seem pretty routine. So
Mm-hmm.
for example, like you go for the 12 people on earth who don't have Facebook profiles, you log onto Facebook, and that's one of the questions they ask you when you sign up is your gender.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, why? Why is this
Yeah.
information going to be shared? How will it be
Yeah.
shared? And part of you is like, I think this is so that they can sell me things.
Yeah. Yeah.
So sort of to go back to the design principles idea, just thinking about how our products can affirm people.
Yeah.
And also like working with other people who are different from us, because
Mm-hmm.
they're going to ask tough questions, and being in a space where you can receive feedback and maybe not be defensive about it, but just be like, I don't have all the answers. I want to have this conversation. I want someone to look at this and say, oh, well, why isn't this field editable? Can I change the username? And just really being open to that rather than just being like, well, that's the way we've always done it.
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah.
we don't have enough resources to do that.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's push beyond that a little bit.
Yeah, a couple of the things that we do at T.I.Y is that we really have an emphasis on empathy, and we've really focused on empathy-driven development. So kind of you've got test-driven development, behavior-driven development, where it's like you're incorporating some of these things into your normal day-to-day practice. And I think that's the whole idea, is just, okay, let me spend, a couple of seconds just thinking through who would be impacted by my decision. Is there anything I'm not thinking of? I love that term of stress cases, because then it talks about impact, not numbers of people, right? And then we've used mob programming practices, which is where you're coding as a group. The name of it isn't great, but that's kind of, if you wanted to Google the practice of how to do it, it's actually you're coding as a group, not as an individual, a bunch of individuals. And that's been transformative too, because it forces that dialogue while you're developing the feature together. And it could kind of uncover. So those are two practices. Ariel has a really great question where she says, I hear what you're saying about what if someone types a bad word in the name of use field. And this is a situation where designing to protect users against harassment butts up against allowing user to better define their online presence. And at scale, abuse of these things like open fields on forums is a real problem. Are there any thoughts about these kind of colliding factors? I like that term. And then what are the limits of our role to protect users?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, and it's complicated. And some of it'll also come down to how we create community online, and the amount of effort as organizations we're willing to put into proactively supporting these communities, and maybe creating rules wherein not everyone can participate if they don't respect other folks. That's may seem like kind of a cop-out answer, but I think abuse is going to happen regardless. So I don't think that that it should be used as a way to push back against like inclusive design principles, but it should always be forefront. Should be front of mind. Also thinking about how could people abuse a system. I think it's really important to think of ahead of time as much as possible to create some boundaries for that. So
yeah,
it's a really squishy answer, but it's a great question.
Yeah, it is. I know that kind of in the open source world, Coraline Ada Emke has done some really amazing work around the contributor covenant that has been adopted by over 250,000 open source projects now. So if you think of an open source project, chances are they're using it. And it's an empathy-driven code of conduct that really focuses on the type of moderation and using moderation as a defense against kind of abuse while protecting people who, so rather than using the system to defend against it, you're using humans to moderate as a defense against it, and really building that community too. They've done amazing work there. So that might be something to look at. But yeah, I do think that it's a balance. I think it also depends on the context of the system that you're using or that you're working on as well. So,
yeah, well, and remembering that the folks who are doing the moderation for you are humans too, and building in supports for folks, especially if they're dealing day to day with content that is just either offensive, that's harmful, it's cruel, it's violent, just creating a lot of space for those folks to be able to either limit their exposure or really generously reward them for doing that work.
Are there any apps or systems that you think we could look at as kind of an example of it done well? So if people wanted to maybe look at different patterns for learning kind of how to really implement some more trans-affirming practices, it's, well, this site does it really, really well, and maybe some of the specific things that they do.
Yeah, I think there's a smattering of different places that are doing a good job of this. And there's some publications online as well. Ways to ask for gender on a form. Like if you actually need to ask for it, there's some emerging standards about how to do that, and explaining why that's being asked for in the first place. There's a few different products where I think they're really doing an excellent job of not assuming the gender of their users, and in their visual design, in their copy, in their social media, are really reinforcing this idea that that you're not just using one set of pronouns if you're using this product. So I'm thinking about Thinx period underwear. So let's go ahead and get it out there that not everybody who has a period identifies as a woman, and not everybody who identifies as a woman has a period. So it's sort of these essentialist ideas. So Thinx does a really good job of being like, this underwear is for people who have periods. Period.
Yeah.
And so everything ripples out from that. And you can see it reflected in all of their digital communications. Clue, there's a period tracking app, similar deal. And I'll also note that, the Apple Health app didn't include period tracking until it was like a couple of years in. And that reflected a bias of their developers.
Yeah.
Because their developers didn't have periods.
Yeah.
Or likely didn't.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we can look at specific products like that. We can look at research about best way to collect gender information for forms. And it's an evolving practice, and it's one that requires vigilance, and it requires reading and staying on top of things, and staying up to date. That's Leroy.
Yeah. Has opinions. I love it. Well, if you all have any questions, definitely type them into the Q&A. I have a bajillion, so I can keep going, but also wanted to make sure that everybody on here felt empowered to have their questions answered as well. So Ashley Brewer says that Big Bud Press is a small clothing brand that doesn't distinguish gender in their navigation and has a gender inclusive model size guide, which is really nice. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a great example.
Yeah. Yeah, I know I've seen, I can't remember off the top of my head too, but like stock image libraries, I think that's another thing too. Like we can also think about representation too. So not so much in the abstract, like data modeling size as well, but even in the like visual communication. And I know I worked as a copywriter for a long time, and even 10 years ago, it was the only stock images that you could find were of white people who were happy in an office. And so having people who look intentionally like the real world, right? And I know that there are a few stock photo libraries that are specific for people who represent a non-binary or, not binary gender. I am messing this up, and I apologize, Erin.
No,
help me.
I know. I think it's helpful. I think
I'm trying. Yeah.
Well, what we really want to do is just reflect the broad spectrum of lived experiences and how people present themselves to the world. Because even folks who identify as cisgender women, they don't all present the same way. They do femininity differently, or they don't do it at all.
Yeah.
So there's just such a diversity of ways that people move through the world. And when we sort of limit that, what we do is just reduce each other to these just sort of flimsy stereotypes. And that just like doesn't allow us to live in the richness of our actual experience. So when we talk about making changes like this, we're creating something that affirms the diversity of all of our experiences, regardless of how we identify. And it just like makes a more just world for each other, which is really what we're going for here.
Yeah. And I think for people who maybe have the experience of being excluded, or have had, like, you were explaining, where it's like didn't feel like you fit into the binaries that were out there. I think having the power there, but it's also not up to the people who have been marginalized to do the work. I think that's really important too, to note that, if you are cisgender, or if you identify in any, kind of majority, that it's your job, even more, I would say, to advocate for creating more equality and inclusion, because everybody else has enough psychological burden of just existing in the world that has been constructed around them, where they may not feel like they're included.
I'll add on to this that I still think that it's far easier for us to talk about differences in gender and sexual orientation than it is in the US, at least, for us to talk about differences in race and
Yeah.
historic institutionalized oppression of Black and brown people. And I think that's something that a lot of white people who are like genderqueer or queer can often overlook. And so it's so I think it's just really important to bring that into the conversation. And America is going to get less white and more gender diverse over our lifetimes and beyond.
Yeah.
So how can we create spaces that really reflect that, and also like build a pipeline of professionals who reflect that lived experience and who can thus create digital products. Because that's a whole other thing, is hiring and talent development and making our profession more diverse.
Yeah, I know when we had Dr. Jana on, they were talking about using empathy and using your own lived experience of feeling othered to then use that experience as a way to do the intersectionality. So it's like maybe you were the youngest person in the room, or we've all had some experience of being othered in some way, and connecting to that feeling of it. And I don't really like that. It was hard for me to speak up. And then using that feeling to then explore the intersectionality. So we've talked about, race. Are there other places, if we're using intersectionality as a model, where while we're thinking about making our systems more inclusive, that we also want to look at too?
Yeah, I think ability is definitely at the forefront. So, increasing percentage of folks who just need more accessible digital platforms. I think about Zoom and how it's really democratized access to a lot of things, allowed folks who maybe have mobility issues to be able to attend events. Chat allows folks who may have hearing loss to ask for clarification on questions, to engage in conversation with folks, to catch up and make sure that they're following. So I think there's so many affordances of digital design that really show a lot of promise. And I think we really need to continue carry that momentum forward. And also in thinking about times when folks feel left out or feel othered, it's also important to remember that that's definitely a visceral feeling, and also recognizing that discrimination based on race, gender, sexual orientation is institutional, it's oppressive, and it's different because it's widespread. So I think embodying that emotion is really helpful in creating empathy, and also understanding that, I moved to the South and I was the only person who wasn't from the South is different from I was the only Black person in the room. So it's a little bit of both and, holding multiple things to be true at the same time. And I think we can do that.
And I think
we can do it.
What you said about moving from kind of an either or kind of framework or, perspective in the way that you view the world to moving to more of a both and, I think that's been a big shift that I've seen probably over the past 5 years, and not just in the diversity, equity, and inclusion spaces, but just recognizing that I don't want to say multiple realities, but there are multiple ways of existing within the same space, and that it's not my job to put my assumptions into a system. I think the other thing that I've said to is that when you're building software, a lot of it is about validating your assumptions. Like, we do test-driven development to validate our assumptions to make sure that bugs don't get introduced into the system. And so expanding our view of that to include kind of the human experience as well, in terms of, okay, unconscious bias exists. I didn't know about it until, maybe 5-6 years ago. Okay, I know that now it's a thing, and I'm going to recognize it, and just as I'm moving through my day-to-day work, kind of keep it in check and say, how is this showing up? And then making a change when you can. Because a lot of times, I think too, we think sometimes the way that we solve systemic problems such as racism, sexism, not being inclusive for the full spectrum of genders, the way to do that is through big sweeping structural change. And there is a place for that, but a lot of times too, it's the marginal gains. It's the small things that everyone does. So an example would be like showing your pronouns on Zoom, right? And then it just makes it normal, right? Like,
yeah, just normalizing it.
So it's normalizing it. Are there other practices such as that where there are maybe small tweaks that you feel go kind of a big way?
Oh yeah. I was jotting down some notes before we got together. I was like, okay, what would I want people to take forward with them from today, like actionable things, next steps that they could do at their own institution. So, going back to that small win idea, doing a form audit, looking at how you collect names, explaining when you need a legal name and when you don't, allowing folks to create usernames. If you have a form that collects people's titles, like Mr., Ms., Doctor, add the gender inclusive MX honorific, and don't make the field required, because some folks just don't want the title. If you're asking for gender, figure out why. Look at how you can be more inclusive. If you do have to collect that information, and in your workplace, making pronouns really normalized, and creating room for the singular they, creating room for pronouns outside of the ones.
I have that in my notes to make sure we bring up the singular they, because that was one of the things that you and I bonded over like years ago. And I remember that the singular they was like the linguistics like word of the year many years ago.
Yeah. Well, like, so many folks will be like, oh, it's just not grammatically accurate. And, there's a couple of retorts to that. One is that the AP style book, and I believe Chicago most recently have added this to their style guide.
I think AP, it was a while ago. I think it was in like 2012 or 2013. It was a while ago.
Yeah. So I think pushing back with this grammar notion is like, okay, well, use farther and further correctly for me, please, in a sentence. Like, really, is this the hill you're going to die on?
Yeah.
Or can we just move ahead with this?
Yeah.
So style guides in general, take a look at if you're using any imagery, is it just live white women, live young white women? If so, then maybe think about something else to include there. So see, privacy audit. So look at what data you're collecting, how you're storing it, how you're using it, whether you need to store it or collect it in the first place, how you might protect your users' privacy, and the benefits and drawbacks of doing that. One benefit is that you get a lot more trust. And the drawback is maybe your advertisers aren't as happy, or you're not able to do deep analytics. But at the same time, when we use gender in our analytics, it results in these overgeneralizations and these essentialized views of how gender works, and that just ain't it.
Yeah. Teresa has a question, and I'll encourage, we've got about 10 minutes left. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A or the chat, and we can for sure incorporate them. So Teresa has a question of back to the gender inclusive work group. Can you talk about the importance of including our trans and non-binary student workers in our discussions? I remember seeing a documentary on CRISPR, and which is about like DNA editing, and they were interviewing someone from the deaf community, and they had a saying that I really liked, and it said, "Don't make a decision about us without us." And do you feel like that applies here as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Teresa, for that question. Teresa was on our gender inclusive work group.
Yay!
Thanks, member of that group.
I appreciate the work you did.
So part of our work as a group was to acknowledge that we didn't have all the answers, and that we have biases built in as folks who, not part of the college age cohort, not part of that generation. I've been working at the library for a while, been working at the university for a while. So each of us sort of has these baked in assumptions, beliefs, knowledge, etc., about the way things are and the way they can be. So we ended up talking with several students who worked at the library, who identified as trans or non-binary. Library is one of the biggest employers on campus, one of the biggest student employers on campus. And so we just put out a call and said, you're working for us. As part of your hours worked, if you want to volunteer to join this conversation, we really appreciate hearing from you. And we got more insight from that hour with the students than we would have been able to generate on our own. So I think, moving forward, just having conversations with folks who are impacted, focus groups, user studies, bring them in for UX testing, just talking to people about the impact of the product is just so immensely helpful. And it gets you so much more valuable information, even than assuming or guessing, or even reading an article on a list apart. Faster.
Do you have any techniques when you run your focus groups? Because I know like the way that you ask questions can sometimes be loaded. Like, do you have any techniques there for how to conduct some of those information gathering sessions and in a way where you're not imbuing your bias in the question so that you're getting the answer that you want back, which is something that humans do? I don't know, that might be kind of,
that's a great question. And like we only had one focus group about this with students, so, and we were really just asking about pain points. It's like what makes it harder to be in this space? Because you don't use your full legal first name, because you need to plan out your day based on where you can pee. So, and the students were just really forthcoming also, because when it's something that's a pain point for you that affects how you can live, and you feel like you're given a venue to really talk about the impact, then, and if you feel safe to share, then you're gonna open up. And we felt really lucky that the students were just like, and this thing, and when I log onto the computer, it has my dead name displaying in the upper right hand corner, and I just like have to stare at it all day. When I open up, X software program. So there were some things we were able to gather from that discussion that were like, okay, well, what we'll do, because the university doesn't do name of use yet, we just won't display your name. So it was sort of we're not going to display any name. Rather than just display the wrong name, we'll just not display anything. So sort of that reducing the harm when possible, when we weren't able to get at sort of the root cause of what was going on.
And that makes me think, like, in the agile software development space, there's the idea of the best next step, where you may not be able to implement the fully formed ideal solution, but what's the best thing that you can do under the constraints that you're under, and at least then you're making forward movement. So it sounds like that's a great example of that.
Yeah, that's perfect. Just like it doesn't have to, and sometimes I'm like, it doesn't even have to be the best next step. It just needs to be a next step. Just one thing that can be done. And I think often in diversity and equity work, we can get held up thinking about, okay, well, what do we need to do? Like, what's the gold standard to solve this problem? When, we just kind of need to push forward with something. We need to make some change and then keep moving and iterate.
So we've got about 5 minutes left. Any kind of last imparting thoughts that you really want people to kind of take away from our conversation?
So we talked a little about low-hanging fruit on your digital systems, your forms, your name management, pronouns, honorifics, images, style guides, user testing. I think the big thing to take away is that it's messy. It's a moving target. It's hard. And also it's everybody's job.
Very well said. Very well said. Thank you so much, Erin. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.
I think you're amazing. And I think the work you're doing is really important. If people wanted to connect with you, learn more about you, where is the best place for them to do that?
I saw Nick sent out my LinkedIn profile, which I do log into that site on occasion. I'm also on the Twitters at Erin R. White. That's where I hang out most of the time. So happy to connect with folks there as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you again. And Nick, I will toss it back over to you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrea, and thanks so much, Aaron. This has been fantastic. We really appreciate it, and appreciate everyone for joining today. And thanks so much to Corgi Bites and to you, Andrea, for your support and for helping us program this event. And Aaron, again, thanks for your time. The engagement and the feedback so far have been wonderful, and attendance has been great. So thanks everyone for your participation,
Fantastic.
for joining, and for engaging. So
thanks for hosting
Absolutely.
us. We'll see you soon. Y'all take care.
yep, we'll see you next time
Absolutely.
on RVA Tech's T.I.Y. Tech It Yourself webinar series. Bye, everyone.